Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hang on one second while I just pull up my Zoom. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. As Alyssa mentioned, today's presentation will be on the neurobiology of trauma and trauma-informed response. I am Natalie Scott. I'm MCASA's Sexual Assault Response Team and Sexual Assault Forensic Exam Policy Advocate. And I'm joined today by Grace Rupp, who is MCASA's Sexual Assault Response Team and Prison Rape Elimination Act Policy Specialist. So before we get started, I do just want to mention that, as Alyssa said, we will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions or concerns or comments that come up throughout today's presentation, and also if anything happens like with audio where you can't hear anything, just put it in the chat, and we will try to correct everything going on. And then also, just a content warning. For today's presentation, we will be discussing some pretty serious and upsetting topics. So if at any time you feel the need to step away from your camera or your Zoom, please feel free to do so and take care of yourself as we move through today's presentation. So to start off, we're going to talk about what trauma is. So trauma is a normal emotional response to an extremely distressing event. It's important to emphasize that the word normal in this definition, because the way some people process trauma, they may partake in behaviors that may otherwise seem abnormal. But in the case of trauma, it's a normal way to process what's occurred. So, for example, if somebody has experienced a distressing event and is lying in bed all day crying, that may seem like an abnormal behavior, but given what's occurred, it's a normal response. Another important element to mention in this definition is distressing events, which can vary person to person, which means it's something that we get to decide. I also want to mention just housekeeping, one more thing. I have a really bad habit of talking really fast when I'm presenting. So if at any point I'm talking too fast and you need me to slow down, just put it in the chat and I will do so. Sometimes I just forget. So as we move forward, if you feel comfortable, if you could put in the chat, what are some examples of trauma or some events that could lead to trauma? So just think about that and put it in the chat, and then we'll read through some of your responses. Criminal activities, mental or physical abuse, death, abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, death of a loved one, neglect, events which take control over a person's body away from them, very true. Domestic violence, assault or witnessing assault, finances, home invasions, job loss, loss of income, unexpected change, major life adjustments. These are all really, really great responses. Childhood trauma, harassment, natural disaster, car accidents. Thank you all so much. Community violence. Yeah, I really appreciate those responses because you all do a great job kind of explaining and representing how trauma, so many different events can lead to trauma, and the scope in which those events really, really varies. So thank you so much for sharing. Some other examples that were touched on in the chat and just some other ones me and Grace thought of prior to this presentation are community violence, which I think was said. So shooting, mugging, burglary, physical or sexual assault or bullying, sexual and or physical abuse, which I know was mentioned in the chat, natural disaster, which was also mentioned in the chat. So a hurricane, flood, fire, earthquake, being in or witnessing a serious car accident, sudden, unexpected, or violent death of someone close or a loved one. So that once again was mentioned in the chat. Serious injury, such as burns, a dog attack, major surgery, such as heart surgery, or life-threatening illness, such as childhood cancer, domestic or family violence, dating violence, and then finally war or political violence. such as civil war or terrorism. So thank you all so much for your participation in that. And you all came up with really, really strong examples. So moving on, we're going to continue with another question in the chat. After learning about trauma and some of the events that can lead to it, how do you think someone who is experiencing trauma would behave? You can answer this question in the chat once again if you feel comfortable. Isolation, yeah, that's a great response. Social withdrawal, depressed, sadness, disassociate, substance use withdrawn, angry, anger.
So I think Natalie is frozen. I'm going to take over for reading out through the chat. Anger, numb, excited, unwilling to trust, hypervigilance, avoidance, hypersexual, closed off, erratic, or emotional. All right, so these are all, great responses and great answers. It's important to note that there are other ways, there's a vast array of ways in which people might behave. So you all mentioned a few of them, but crying, hyperventilating, angry, dissociative, in shock, happy, joking, flat affect. These examples kind of go back to the idea of what we were saying earlier. The responses to trauma may seem like abnormal behavior, but they're actually very normal responses. And there's no one way to process trauma. So moving on to the next slide, we are going to discuss the definition of trauma and the symptoms someone who has experienced trauma may demonstrate. It's important to note that I'm going to reference the DSM-5's definition and criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. Keep in mind, the DSM-5 is a diagnostic tool, so someone's experience may not fit perfectly in this box, but they are still experiencing trauma. Not all survivors of sexual violence or trauma in general will necessarily meet the criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD according to the DSM-5. That is normal, and that does not invalidate or suggest that the trauma they experienced was not real or bad enough. The first criteria that the DSM-5 provides for a diagnosis of PTSD is simply that a person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. Important in this diagnosis is direct exposure to or witnessing, meaning indirect exposure. For example, indirect exposures to the details of trauma typically happens for many of us in this field. So first responders, medics, nurses, police officers, advocates, therapists, many of us are exposed and or witness indirectly the trauma that folks have gone through. Other indirect exposure can include things like learning the experiences of a close friend or family member, maybe what they've gone through that was traumatic. So thinking about the trauma symptoms that are in the DSM-5 and the trauma symptoms for PTSD, we're going to go through them, but I want to name that these are just some of the symptoms that you may see in the survivors that you work with. So first and foremost, survivors may re-experience the event. This can look like unwanted memories, nightmares, or flashbacks. Survivors may also demonstrate avoidance behaviors, meaning that they avoid trauma-related reminders or stimuli. So, for example, survivors may avoid certain locations or people that remind them of the event, or even where the event itself took place. When I was working with college students who were also survivors of sexual violence, many of them would avoid certain spots on campus or take different routes to get to their classes. So, really avoiding some of those stimuli that reminded them of the time. So you might also see survivors who isolate. They isolate themselves further, they experience negative thoughts or feelings, even flat affect, you'll see. And this typically can look like just a decreased interest in the things that they used to enjoy. Um, and that can further isolate them, right? If you're not engaging in some of those pleasurable self care activities or those self maintenance activities, as it relates to your trauma experience, that can make managing the symptoms even more difficult. It's really important for me to highlight that these symptoms look different in every person and they're experienced in varying degrees. So, across the board, it's going to look different. All right, so you'll see people again with that isolation or that avoidance behavior as well. So it's not looking like Natalie's quite on yet, so I'm going to continue to take over for these slides. But when we
Wait,
look at
Grace,
the,
can you hear me? Can you
yes,
hear
I
me?
can.
Okay, I'm back, I think. I'm sorry about that. I just moved, and I have not had problems with internet in this home yet, but nothing like a Zoom presentation for that to get started. So I apologize. But moving on. So when we look at the data, 7.8% of the United States population will experience PTSD. It's also important to note that 7.8% who experience PTSD, 31% of those people are sexual assault survivors. So while that is less than half, it is a large percentage of individuals experiencing trauma. So if we look at the graphs on the screen, we can see that demonstrated as well, how 7.8% of the United States population experiences PTSD. And then of that population, 31% of those are sexual assault survivors. And then finally, 94% of women who experience trauma symptoms 2 weeks after an assault. So just to kind of touch on that as well, that trauma symptoms after sexual assault are very prevalent as they exist within 94% of female survivors.
All right, Natalie. So if you wouldn't mind helping me with some of the chat, that would be great. But if folks in the audience could just pop in the chat, what do we know or what do we think about false reporting?
I'll read out the responses, Grace, as they come through. So somebody responded that only 7% of reports are false. Somebody responded, I don't think a large percentage are actually false. The same percent for other crimes.
All right, so thank you for those answers. The reason we bring this up during neuro is because we think it's really important to know where the research from false reporting is coming from and just generally evaluating some of the research practices in this field. So currently, accepted evidence-based peer-reviewed research shows that the true rate of false reports for sexual violence is somewhere between 3 and 8%. For your information and reference, and folks in the chat highlighted this, that is no different than false reporting rates for other crimes. So when someone is sexually assaulted, they may behave in ways that we find difficult to understand. Sometimes those behaviors, because they're difficult for us to understand, can lead to victims being disbelieved about their assault. But what we know about neuros, these behaviors are in fact really common and really normal responses. So I just want to highlight, where does the perception around false reporting come from? Like, where did we get this idea that sexual assaults have a higher false reporting rate? In 1996, Eugene Kanan published a study finding that 41% of rape accusations in a police agency were false, filed to provide an alibi, seek revenge, or obtain sympathy and attention. Victims were told that they would have to submit to a polygraph, and if their account was not able to be proven, they would be charged with a false report. The study only reviewed files from a single unnamed agency without any independent oversight or peer review. What we know about research practices and ethical research practices, this study doesn't align with that. So when we're thinking about including research in our work with survivors, really evaluating both a methodology and where it's coming from. But we say all this to highlight that there are many different regions in the brain impacted by trauma. And today we're going to highlight a few of those regions, and then how might that impact be expressing itself in real time for survivors.
So it's important to explain that many people may think someone is not being honest about their assault because their behaviors might not align with what people or other folks deem a normal or typical response is. But one thing we really want to emphasize throughout today's presentation is that any response or all of these responses that may seem abnormal are all actually very normal responses to trauma. And we will kind of begin to discuss this and explain this as we go into the neurobiology of trauma and kind of explain what happens in the brain during these distressing events.
All right, y'all. So I want to highlight this next video and just flag it for you. It's about 10 minutes long. I'm going to turn on closed captioning. The speakers in the video have a Scottish accent. So just as a heads up, you might want to look at those closed captioning, and then we consistently hear that you need to turn your volume up a little bit to view this video. It is an animated video, and it's based off of victim reporting. So I am going to just quickly turn this on and let me...
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat?
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later, but in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the 3 parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression? Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress?
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatised person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean, in practice, in your job? A traumatised person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronising question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, what can you recall just now? Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog. Barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. I can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move, or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Oi.
So before we move on to our next topic, I just want to briefly mention a technique that was mentioned in that video, which is forensic experiential trauma interviewing, also known as FENI. So this was created by a former special agent named Russell Strand. The purpose of this was to collect as much forensic and physical evidence as possible. So it uses steps that focus on tools that help survivors recall information and implement those into their interviewing style. So this is broken down into steps. The first step is to express genuine empathy or expressing sorrow for what has happened to them. This helps build rapport between the survivor and those interviewing them. The next step is using the approach of using sentences similar to, help me understand what you are able to recall from the experience, making it not so much about chronological order, but more so what the survivor is able to recall as they are able to recall it. And finally, the final step I want to touch on is listening to what the survivor is sharing and also making sure that the interviewer acknowledges the difficulty of the situation. It's also important to focus on what can be remembered. So, for example, instead of focusing on a specific narrative of what time were you there, who was there, things like that, in that chronological order, focus on what the survivor can recall. So, does the survivor remember any specific sounds or colors or sensations? Like in that video, we heard that the survivor experienced a sound of a dog and they recalled the smell of secondhand smoke. So, focusing on those things that can be recalled as they're able to be recalled.
So Natalie and I want to review officer-involved shooting guidelines to provide further context into neuro. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police sets guidelines for officers involved in shootings, meaning how police agencies should respond after an officer fires a weapon directed towards civilian populations. The IACP recommends that officers who fired a weapon or were directly involved in what's called a critical incident should be encouraged to step away immediately from the scene and be transported to a safe and supportive environment by a trusted peer or supervisor. While officers may be asked to provide pertinent information as soon as possible after the shooting to aid in that initial investigation process, wherever feasible, officers should have some recovery time before providing that full formal statement. Depending on the nature of the incident, the demands of the agency, and the emotional and physical wellness of the officers, this can range to a few hours to even a few days. So if we're expecting officers to have this support and agencies to meet these elements for their employees, shouldn't we be expecting the same for survivors after sexual assault? They should have access to that same safe place, access to that privileged communication, so that supervisor or mentor piece. For survivors, that typically looks like a confidential advocate, and then again, allowed that recovery and rest period. For officers involved in shootings, that's typically one sleep cycle, but we know that most survivors don't have access to that rest and recovery piece.
So now that we have learned about this background information, we can go into the neurobiology of trauma. So we're going to start with different parts of the brain. So to begin, the prefrontal cortex controls normal thoughts and actions, or your executive function. It's also activated and allows you to focus in moments like right now when you're listening to this presentation. The next part of the brain we're going to focus on is the amygdala, which stands for environment threats. It can be known as the fear center sometimes, as it notifies you when you're in a dangerous situation. So when the amygdala starts to go off, the prefrontal cortex goes down and shifts away focus from everyday tasks to the fear you may be experiencing for environmental threats. A good example of this is, let's say you're sitting on a bench reading a book and you're focused on the pages. You notice someone staring at you intensely in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable. You can no longer focus on the pages because your amygdala is going off. Your prefrontal cortex would typically use executive functioning and say, get out of this situation and call a friend or move elsewhere. However, because you may be so focused on fear, your focus on environment threats may prevent this functioning from happening.
So the three structures that we want to begin with thinking about today are held within the HPA axis. So the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands live within the HPA axis or make up it. The hypothalamus is typically referred to as grand central station of the brain. Its primary purpose is to communicate to other structures in the brain and body about what needs to happen. One structure the hypothalamus communicates with is the pituitary gland. And typically that's referred to as the master gland. So it's the gland that communicates to all the other glands throughout your body. In the instance of a traumatic event, it's the gland that's communicating with the adrenals. So these three structures really make up the HPA axis, and it typically functions as a loop. The hypothalamus signals to the pituitary glands, which signals to the adrenal glands to release those hormones. That signal is typically something traumatic is happening in my body, and there needs to be a hormonal release to help the body respond to what is happening. The adrenal gland's job to flood your body with those chemicals and those hormones. So when I talk about hormones, which ones are being released? The first hormone is called catecholamine, and most of us know that one as adrenaline. These are the hormones that would be running through your body in a fight response, so FIGHT response. in the event that your body was going to fight back against the traumatic event that it's responding to. Catecholamines might also be useful in a flee situation. So when you're trying to run away or get away from a threatening situation. Catecholamines are most helpful in that fight or flight response. In conjunction, we also have cortisol, and that's typically what we know as the stress hormone. So cortisol levels are going to affect the amount of energy that our body has to fight back or flee the situation. So if we have an increase in cortisol, typically we have that increase in energy. Shockingly, then we have opiates to blunt any possible physical pain. So they blunt that physical sensation of pain or discomfort. And then lastly, we have oxytocin. And that is, when I started learning about neuro, was a little bit surprising to me because it increases those positive feelings, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think about, if one is experiencing something really traumatic, it's a little bit shocking that we would have that release of oxytocin. But it typically serves as that like natural kind of morphine for the body. And the release of these opiates help in blunting physical and emotional pain that might be happening for folks. What we know though is that this has a cyclical effect. So as Natalie mentioned, the amygdala starts to shut down or shut off your prefrontal cortex. And that signals to the HPA axis to release these stress hormones. So your adrenal glands start to release these. And that means that our planning and executive functioning, that rational piece, starts to shut down even more. So this is where we rely on some of our learned behaviors. Most of us don't have learned behaviors to fall back on. Every one of us has a different neurobiological response. So we all have a response. How it expresses itself might look different. But for most people, that looks like fight, flight, or freeze. So many F words. You'll see folks in the military or law enforcement or even some healthcare professionals. They're trained in how to respond when they're in stressful situations so that they're staying within their own window of tolerance. The idea is that they're building behaviors and habits so that they're not falling back on some of these stress hormones. So when the stress response kick in, they can rely on learned behaviors and respond appropriately. Typically, with the exception of those who have gone through repeated traumatic events, sexual assault survivors do not, nor should they, have the training or learned behaviors to respond appropriately to what's going on around them.
Thank you, Grace. So now that we have discussed fear and our bodily reactions to fear, it's important to go into memory. So the hippocampus is responsible for our memory as it works to encode and store memories. But it is disrupted when fear kicks in. It's also important to mention super encoding versus minimal encoding. So super encoding occurs when you remember something really well, and this can happen during trauma. So for example, someone might be able to remember a picture on a wall in a room where a traumatic event happened. But if someone asks something like, "What time were you in that room?" they might not recall. This is because the brain super encodes signs of danger. So the next time that person sees that picture on a wall, they might feel as though they're in danger. But minimal encoding occurs with things that we might not remember. So like what time it was. And I do want to mention that alcohol can worsen encoding, but it does not stop it altogether.
So what is happening typically when you're seeing someone in front of you? So what's happening to the body during a distressing event? All right, so first we want to highlight overview. It's called the defense cascade. So when all of this is happening in your body, how is that presenting behavior-wise? What would a witness or third party see? This is known as the defense cascade. And this is the motion, so to speak, that someone will go through when they're under threat. When we move through this cascade, it's typically not one and done. Folks can flow through and within these responses. The defense cascade is a continuum. So really important to keep that in mind of innate, hardwired, and automatically active defensive behaviors in response to a threat. This Venn diagram breaks down how the body decides to respond. So again, thinking about survivors can have one, many, and work within this continuum. So this begins when the fear starts to kick in. So typically a survivor will appraise a situation, and if they believe that escape is futile or fatal, dangerous, survival instincts start to come online. I'm going to go through a few of these. So what that might look like in real time is you'll see an arousal response. So most folks' muscles will tense, their breathing and heart rate will increase as their body prepares to act. You might also see or experience fight or flight, and that is the active response to dealing with the threat. You'll see freeze, which Natalie and I will cover in a second, but that's the best way to think about is fight or flight on hold. So those responses just kind of being stuck a little bit. Tonic immobility, survivors might experience when they have the inability to move or call out. So your body starts to really shut down in response to that arousal. You might also see a subset of that, which is called collapsed immobility. That's just a variation of tonic immobility. And you'll see we start to lose our muscle tone and experience changes in our level to consciousness. So we might dip into some unconscious states and then come back into consciousness. So we mention all this because there's real benefit in understanding these reactions as a provider. When we're working with survivors who are experiencing this or have experienced this, we can target our interventions, so how we're supporting people tangibly, to help survivors understand the basis of their defense responses. Being able to provide that psychosocial education piece can help alleviate some of the guilt or other negative emotions that survivors might experience. So if you're able to provide context into why their body might have responded a certain way and how that wasn't within, that wasn't their choice, that can help alleviate some of those negative emotions or feelings. So moving on to fight, flight, and freeze. It's important to note that these are evolved responses. So when the amygdala detects fear, it halts all the other bodily processes that would normally happen in our brain. So we evolved as prey, as human beings. So we evolved to freeze first and then flee if possible. So I think most of us have heard of fight or flight and probably wondered, like, what would I do if I were in this situation? But the one we don't often hear about is that freeze response. So when we think about that, our body experiences something else entirely. You'll see in the animal kingdom, even in human beings especially, our eyes will start to widen, our pupils will start to dilate, and our hearing, so some of our other senses, becomes a lot more accurate and online. So the body is essentially prepping you to fight or flee. that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to take place. That third response is often not talked about. And that's where I see a lot of survivors have questions about. The moment that we realize that we're in danger, that initial freeze, that occurs because our amygdala detects an attack and signals to the brainstem to inhibit our body's movement. It happens quickly, it's automatic, and it's beyond our conscious control. So this freezing is the brain's response that allows us to enter into a state of vigilance for incoming attacks and process possible avenues to escape. It's important to know, though, that the brain may stay sort of stuck in that freezing or freezing is not a word, frozen or freeze response. And when that happens, folks are transitioning into tonic or collapsed immobility.
Thank you. Also, just a heads up, I keep feeling like I have to sneeze and then it doesn't, I don't sneeze. So if I randomly look like my eyes are watering, I might be trying to hold back a sneeze while I'm talking. So my apologies. But moving on. So now that we've kind of talked about the defense cascade and those different defense mechanisms that we experience when we are in a highly stressful or fearful situation, I want to talk about self-protection habits, and specifically some ways that somebody might use self-protection habits. So, for example, if someone is not interested in a sexual activity, they might say some of the examples on the screen. Which is a way in saying no without actually saying no, and the way that somebody might find non-confrontational. So, for example, my partner will be mad. I have an early date tomorrow. My friends are looking for me, and I don't have any condoms. So that's kind of serves as an example of how someone may use these self-protection habits in a way of addressing fear when they are in these sort of stressful and fearful situations. So now after looking at the different ways the body can respond to fear, we're going to kind of talk about those freeze responses, and we'll start with tonic immobility. So this is an uncontrollable paralysis in response to an intense fear, and survivors could describe this as freezing up. Up to 70% of survivors experience tonic immobility during a sexual assault, so it is very, very common.
So when folks get stuck in tonic immobility, they're experiencing collapsed immobility. So they may be unable to move their body entirely. Collapsed immobility is often described as sort of your body feeling like a rag doll. So instead of tensing your muscles up, you start to lose muscle tone. Your heart rate decreases. You may see the loss of consciousness. Folks kind of describe it as going limp. Because of that, the onset and return to homeostasis takes longer than that of tonic immobility. You see this in the animal kingdom if you're familiar with possums playing dead for extended periods of time. It's going to take a while for their bodies to come back from that experience. So this can explain or provide context to why survivors of sexual violence, sometimes they fall asleep after they've experienced rape. So a lot of people say things like, oh, well, how could she have slept over after she was just sexually violated? But collapsed immobility can help provide context into that. Because it disrupts signals from your brainstem that ordinarily keep your muscle tone, so that it renders an individual immobile and collapsed. In response to brain hypoxia, the individual also can experience changes to levels of consciousness, which might look like sleeping.
So I also want to touch on, as Grace kind of mentioned with possums, neuroresponses in the animal kingdom. So there are a lot of examples of tonic immobility within the animal kingdom. So for example, sharks, chickens. So we can see on the screen right there with the shark, Chickens, fainting goats are also very common. I know that was like an internet phenomenon for a while as well. So those are all examples of tonic immobility in the animal kingdom. Moving on, there's also collapsed immobility. So that includes snakes, possums, and impalas. So we can see the possum on the screen. And then, as already mentioned, humans engage in both tonic and collapsed immobility. So it's important to talk about these examples in real life and among other species because survivors may engage in self-blaming behaviors like, why did I freeze? Why didn't I yell for help? But explaining that it's a physiological response and happens in other species as well can help survivors understand that it's not their fault and it was not their choice.
So I do just want to highlight disassociation, and this can happen during the assault or after the fact, but it is another neurobiological response. You'll see disassociation described as sort of feeling blank, almost entirely disconnected from your body. This can look like a variety of different behaviors in a variety of settings. But within sexual violence, survivors will describe it again as like feeling blank outside of their body or even hovering above your body, like you're a third party witness. You'll also hear folks describe it as feeling like they've entered onto sort of this autopilot mode. Sometimes that may also mean that the survivor may do exactly what a perpetrator tells them to do. Entering autopilot mode or disassociating entirely is a survival response and can be used as sort of self-protection.
So, as we move on throughout this topic, I want to kind of close our loop on the defense cascade. So this is a video of the defense cascade in action. It's a video of a cat and a mouse, and it's a great example of that defense cascade in action. So you will see the mouse go through different methods of defense. It is important to mention that I know watching a cat and mouse play together is very nerve-wracking. No animals get harmed in this video. So just keep that in mind. We're also not going to play the sound because the background music is kind of annoying. So we'll just watch this video and you can kind of see the mouse move through those different defense mechanisms. So I think that video is just a great example. You see the mouse going back between freezing and fighting. So in the beginning, the mouse was frozen on the floor. And then as we move through the video, the mouse tries to fight back with the cat. So you can see how that serves as a good example as someone can move through those different defenses. Even though I personally get very nervous watching the mouse try to fight the cat, but it ends up okay, even though I've seen it a million times.
All right, so what are the consequences for survivors? We know that survivors may experience that increase in self-blame, doubt, There's a growing body of research that survivors who experience tonic or collapsed immobility may be less likely to report. There are, again, more studies coming out that show there's a link between tonic immobility and then diagnoses of depression and PTSD symptoms. So as a provider, being able to translate what's happening neurobiologically can be a really powerful tool.
So now we're going to kind of shift focus and talk about understanding brain activity, specifically when it comes to attention and focus. So to begin, we're going to talk about top-down attention, which is the internal guidance of attention and focus on what will help us meet our goals. So for example, looking at the main goal we want to achieve and then focusing on the actions that can help us meet those goals. This is different from bottom-up attention, which is driven purely by external stimuli and factors, and is also a fear response. So, for example, if someone points a weapon at you, you might only be able to focus on the weapon in front of your face and not who is holding it. So when someone asks you to describe the person who held this weapon at you, you might not be able to recall because you were driven by fear to focus elsewhere and your attention was driven directly on that weapon.
So again, thinking about that brain activity piece within the context of perpetrators and survivors, when we look at the differences in response and brain activity between perpetrators and survivors, there's some pretty stark differences. So in the typical perpetrator setting, you'll see folks who are not stressed. So their prefrontal cortex is in control and online. So they're more in control with their prefrontal cortex than the emotional parts of your brain, even when the perpetrator may be acting in compulsive ways. So the perpetrator is able to think clearly and carry out planned actions and respond. So if this happens, then I'll do this. And being able to think through that and direct and modify their behaviors. So for survivors, the fear circuitry has kicked in, like we mentioned, and typically that expresses itself in fear or overwhelm. So the prefrontal cortex is almost entirely shut down. So thoughts are driven by perpetrator actions. So what Natalie mentioned about that top-down versus bottom-up attention. Behaviors are controlled by reflex. And sometimes, again, those learned behaviors are habitual responses. But again, actions and attention are driven by perpetrator action and stimuli.
So when talking about trauma, it's also important to be aware and address secondary victimization. So secondary victimization is the re-traumatization following a sexual assault due to contact with law enforcement, investigators, other service providers, and medical staff. It can be caused by victim blaming, mistrust, negative judgments, and it causes increased trauma, shame, and may make survivors disengage from services. I do want to mention that one study found that over 90% of victims encountered secondary victimization behaviors in their encounters with law enforcement. So just to kind of repeat that, 90% of victims encountered secondary victimization behavior in encounters with law enforcement. So I did want to touch on that as we move through this discussion on trauma.
As we transition towards the latter half of our presentation, Natalie and I really want to talk about trauma-informed services and the value of trauma-informed care. So running through this hypothetical, I will do it myself. You do not have to participate in this one. If you were to ask me, would you be willing to share the best details, or who would you be willing to share the best details of your sexual experience with? The answer to that for me is probably no one, or those who I am deeply and intimately close with. So maybe a dear friend, maybe a clinician, maybe my partner. But why am I asking this in a Zoom room? The answer is, if I'm unwilling to share my best sexual experience, so my most positive, with only a really, really short list of people, how can we expect someone, in this case me, to share their worst sexual experience with strangers? Or even potentially the worst, most traumatic thing that's ever happened to them to strangers and people that they don't know and don't trust. My opinion, that is a Herculean task to ask of someone. So when someone reports for support or reports to law enforcement, we are asking survivors to share potentially one of the most traumatizing and intimate things that they have experienced in their lives. And we're asking them to do that with a total stranger. So when we think about working with survivors, we want to think about trauma-informed services. We want to ensure that our response to survivors is trauma-informed, meaning that advocates, clinicians, nurses, law enforcement, correctional staff, and other service providers need to be able to recognize these normal trauma reactions that we've covered today. They want to work towards strengthening their response by communicating in ways to survivors that meet them where they are. And then we also want to adapt and adjust our services, regardless of how we provide those services and in what setting, to avoid increasing trauma and helping survivors manage those symptoms. This is best done with trauma-informed care. So I'm sure other folks at Zavit have gone over this with you, but the 6 values of trauma-informed services are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, empowerment, voice and choice, collaboration, and then keeping in mind cultural, historical, and gender issues. When we think about trauma-informed services, it's important to remember that they can and do look different depending on your role in responding to and supporting survivors. So when I'm, enacting trauma-informed care with the survivors I'm working with as an advocate, that's going to look different than a law enforcement officer who is working towards trauma-informed care. And that is absolutely fine, and that's how it should be, but the 6 core values of trauma-informed care remain the same.
So, when providing service to a victim of sexual assault, it's important to understand that there's no such thing as a perfect or typical victim. So, always keep this in mind. It's also important to realize forgetting details of an assault is perfectly normal, but there are exceptions. So, if a person does remember a lot of details, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not being truthful.
I'm going to cover some of the don'ts. As we covered today, as survivors may experience a wide range of behaviors and emotions. There is no one way to respond to or prepare for sexual violence. It is difficult to know the best choices, even when we are regulated. The way our bodies respond to trauma and sexual violence, it's not a choice. We can't decide to go into tonic or collapsed immobility or fight, flight, freeze. Our body just does that. So the way we respond to trauma is not our choice. If survivors, can remember something and they feel comfortable talking to you about that, and they would like to, you can ask them questions like, can you tell me more about that? are you comfortable sharing that? So really that informed consent piece, rather than those sort of where, when, what, why questions. We also generally want to avoid why questions across the board. So while we may have really good intentions in asking why questions, we may unintentionally fall into victim blaming behavior, and we may be well intended, but we also have to recognize our impact on survivors. It's helpful to remember that survivors may recall more information, typically after like 48 hours of sleep, so 2 full sleep cycles. And it's really normal to have very clear sensory memories, but miss out on contextual information. So again, that chronological piece can be really difficult. I also want to name, like Natalie did, there are always exceptions. Do not be skeptical of the person who remembers everything in chronological detail with explicit details. Our brains work in different ways, person to person, and we all process trauma differently. So again, we don't want to expect that perfect or typical victim. We can expect a wide range of behaviors and emotions. And we always want to avoid those why questions, especially around fighting back or fleeing. So important takeaways for me is that trauma-informed care is mutually beneficial. Survivors avoid that secondary victimization that Natalie mentioned. And then as providers, we are able to do our jobs more effectively, and we can avoid some of that compassion fatigue and burnout as well when we practice trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is based on the recognition that many behaviors and responses, often seen as symptoms expressed by survivors, are directly related to traumatic experiences, and these can cause mental, physical, emotional concerns for survivors.
So thank you all so much for engaging in today's presentation. I think we have around 5 minutes left if anybody wants to put any questions they have for us in the chat. We can also share our contact info if anyone has any questions that they have that comes up later on. But thank you all so much for engaging. Yeah, there it is on the screen. So I appreciate you guys' participation and everybody's time and bearing with me through my technical difficulties. Grace, thank you for taking over. And I think Alyssa's putting an evaluation form in the chat. If you all could please fill that out.